The daycare sat like any other in a quiet American suburb, colorful on the outside, innocent on the surface, and wrapped in the kind of stillness people walk past every day without question. But beneath its polished wooden floors and smiling cartoon murals, something had been sleeping for decades, something built in silence and buried by design. No one in Fairpoint ever imagined that a routine check by AK-9 unit would rip the lid off a secret this old, or that it would begin with a single scratch on the floor. The truth had waited long enough, and when it came, it didn't knock. It clawed its way to the surface. This wasn't just about a dog sniffing out something strange. This was about a hidden chapter of the town's history, something no one dared to suspect, locked away beneath crayons and nap mats. When Officer Andrew Grayson stepped into that daycare on a calm summer morning, he thought it would be just another box to check off before lunch. But his partner, a German shepherd named Atlas, had a nose for the kind of truths that buildings try to forget. One scratch, one whimper, one hidden panel, and the ground beneath Fairpoint began to tremble with the weight of what had been kept secret for so long. Before we begin this gripping, emotional edge-of-your-seat journey into a forgotten world, beneath a place meant for laughter and safety, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what this dog uncovers next. It was just after 8:00 a.m. when Officer Andrew Grayson steered his cruiser into the small shaded parking lot of Bright Pines' daycare. A slight breeze stirred the branches of two massive oaks that stood like silent sentries on either side of the building. The front windows were lined with cut-out paper suns and crooked drawings. Their colors faded from time and sunlight. The building itself looked recently painted, a soft yellow facade with a cheerful blue trim. But the foundation felt older, like it had grown tired of pretending to be something new. Atlas sat upright in the back seat, ears perked, eyes sharp. His tail thumped once against the seat before going still again. This was supposed to be a quick assignment. A vague tip had come through dispatch the night before. Something about strange sounds under the floor and cold air in the reading corner. No specific threat, no signs of forced entry, no official concern, but protocol was protocol. And Andrew had learned long ago to listen when Atlas picked up on something that didn't sit right. He grabbed the leash and opened the back door. Atlas jumped out, landing cleanly on the pavement, his frame lean and powerful, his coat glossy in the morning sun. The entrance to the daycare creaked slightly as Andrew pushed it open. Inside, the scent of lemon disinfectant blended with the faint trace of finger paints and snack crumbs. Everything was just as it should be. Tiny cubbies lined the front wall, each labeled with a child's name, their backpacks hanging neatly. Plastic bins of toys sat organized by color and shape, and a gentle tune played from a dusty speaker in the corner. But Atlas didn't pause to take any of it in. The moment his paws hit the rubber flooring, his head dropped low, nose working in quick, precise sniffs. He didn't follow the main hallway toward the offices. He turned left instead, pulling slightly at the leash, guiding Andrew past the play kitchen and reading nook toward the back corner of the main room. There, near a bookshelf lined with worn storybooks, Atlas stopped, his tail stiffened. He took a cautious step forward and lowered his body, ears flattening. Then he let out a low, uncertain growl and began to scratch. At first, Andrew didn't think much of it. Dogs scratch sometimes at bugs, sometimes at smells. But the way Atlas's paws clawed at that specific spot on the floor again and again with increasing urgency, it wasn't random. The wood under the soft foam mat looked slightly different. Maybe it was just a discoloration, or maybe it was something more. Andrew stepped closer, gently pulling back the mat with one hand, while Atlas continued to scrape at the surface. The floor underneath was marked by a faint outline, an almost perfect square, barely visible unless someone was looking for it. A single groove, thin as a paper cut, ran along the edge. Andrew's brow furrowed as he crouched beside it, fingers tracing the boundary that separated it from the rest of the floorboards. There was no latch, no hinges, no reason this part of the room should be different. And yet, here it was, hidden beneath a corner children used for storytelling and rest. A secret buried under lullabies and laughter. Atlas stopped scratching and looked up, his deep brown eyes locked on Andrew's. There was something in the silence that followed, a moment of stillness that felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The officer leaned closer, pressed his hand to the floor, and felt it, cold air rising through the cracks. Something was waiting below. The cold air leaking through the cracks in the floor felt unnatural inside a daycare that should have been warm, quiet, and comforting. It carried with it the scent of dust and stillness, something untouched by time or daylight. Officer Andrew Grayson ran his hand once more along the groove beneath the mat, this time pressing gently until his fingertips felt resistance, a metallic ridge nearly flush with the wooden plank. It was a handle recessed deep enough to go unnoticed unless someone knew exactly where to look. He gripped it cautiously, bracing himself as Atlas stood alert beside him, tail rigid, ears angled forward in focused anticipation. With one firm tug, the wooden section gave way, revealing a narrow, square hatch that creaked open on hidden hinges. A thin cloud of stale air rose from the darkness beneath, mixing with the sterile scents above. Andrew stared into the opening, deep and shadowy, with the top of a rusted iron ladder just visible along one side. The shaft stretched downward, far beyond the reach of the morning light that filtered through the classroom windows. Dust particles shimmered like fragments of forgotten memories as they drifted into the air. The silence became heavier. Atlas moved first, placing his front paws at the edge, peering down with intense concentration, nose twitching at the unfamiliar. Odors rising from below. Andrew unclipped the leash but gave no command. Atlas descended without hesitation, placing each paw with deliberate precision. The officer followed, careful not to disturb the ladder's integrity as he eased himself into the darkened void. The rungs groaned under their weight, old and likely untouched for years, possibly decades. The descent felt longer than it should have. With each step, the light from above faded until it disappeared entirely, replaced by the dim glow of a small utility bulb flickering somewhere in the distance below. At the bottom of the ladder, Andrew stepped onto a solid concrete floor. The space was narrow and low-ceilinged with thick concrete walls stretching ahead in both directions. Faint lights were strung overhead, connected by old wiring that pulsed weakly every few seconds. The air down here was heavy, dry, and cold, clinging to the skin like the memory of winter. The hallway stretched forward in a straight line with no immediate sign of its purpose. Pipes lined one wall, some rusted, others wrapped in disintegrating insulation. In places, the cement bore faint stains, water damage, or something older harder to identify. Atlas moved ahead slowly, paws silent on the concrete, his head low and ears swiveling as he scanned every detail. His body language changed, tense but curious. He was no longer reacting to a random scent. He was tracking something specific. Andrew walked behind him, boots echoing softly off the walls. He glanced at the ceiling low enough that his head nearly touched it and noticed the grime. That coated everything? This tunnel had been built intentionally, but its age and design suggested it had never been meant for public access. It was more than a basement, more than a shelter. It was a structure with purpose, yet none that made sense in a facility for children. As they moved deeper into the corridor, markings began to appear. Faint graffiti scrolled along the walls, barely visible under the layer of grime and decay. Dozens of them. Some were carved directly into the concrete, others painted, or etched into the crumbling surface. Different handwriting, different styles, some neat, others frantic. There were no last names, just first names. Caleb, Marcus, Eli, Jonah, and besides some faint dates faded nearly to invisibility, some of the names had been crossed out. The effect was chilling. These weren't random doodles or childlike scribbles. These were records. A form of silent testimony from someone or many who had once passed through here. Atlas stopped again, this time at a metal door set into the wall at the end of the hall. The paint on it had peeled away, revealing rust underneath. A small square window set into its top half had been blacked out from the inside. The air near the door felt cooler, more stagnant. Andrew reached out and pressed his hand against the metal, ice cold, even after the summer heat they'd left above. Without speaking, without hesitating, he pulled the door open. The room beyond was small, no larger than a classroom, but stark and clinical. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a sterile light over the concrete floor. In the center sat an old folding table and a chair, both coated in dust. Along one entire wall was a bulletin board, and on it were dozens of photographs, all neatly arranged. Boys, all of them different ages, different ethnic backgrounds. Each one sat cross-legged on a tile floor, wearing identical plain shirts with white tags pinned to their collars. Their expressions were blank, faces uncomfortably still. Each photo had a name and a date written in fine black ink beneath it. Atlas let out a low huff, breaking the thick silence. Andrew stepped closer to the photos. None of the children looked familiar, but something about their eyes, their lifeless stillness, made the room feel colder. He counted them silently. 39 photographs, each marked, labeled, recorded. This was not an accident, this was a system. Behind them, something creaked faintly in the tunnel. Atlas turned, body tense, as if listening for something unseen. Andrew's gaze lingered on one photo near the corner of the board, its edges curled, its surface cracked from age. The date underneath was nearly 4 decades old, and the boy in the picture was smiling. The photograph with the smiling boy lingered in Andrew's mind like a whispered warning. Unlike the others, his smile was slight but present, just enough to unsettle the frozen stillness of the rest. Something about it didn't feel like joy. It felt more like a mask, a carefully constructed expression meant to mimic comfort in a place that allowed none. The boy's eyes were the giveaway. Vacant, deep, too old for the rest of his face. Behind him in the photo was the same folding chair and plain background that appeared in the other portraits. It was a pattern, and patterns like these never formed by coincidence. Atlas shifted beside the table, moving toward the wall behind the chair. Dust stirred beneath his paws as he sniffed at the concrete, tracing invisible lines along the base. Andrew turned from the photographs and followed him. That part of the wall was blank. No markings, no switches, no signs of disturbance. Yet the way Atlas moved, slow and focused, suggested something hidden. His nose paused at one point, then tapped lightly against a narrow seam in the surface. Andrew crouched, running his fingers across the spot. The concrete had a fine line cutting through it, a vertical edge just barely out of alignment with the rest of the wall. There was no handle, but the indentation was unmistakable. A concealed doorway, once sealed with precision, now betrayed. By time, Andrew stepped back and pressed against it with his shoulder. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a dry, grinding sound, the edge shifted inward. Dust poured down from the top as the hidden door cracked open, revealing a dark cavity behind it. The air escaping the space was colder than the room behind him. It carried no sound, only silence thick enough to feel alive. He clicked on his flashlight, the narrow beam slicing into the darkness. The light swept over concrete walls similar to those outside, but here the surfaces were smoother, cleaner, almost sterile. A small rectangular room stretched about 12 feet across. In the far corner sat a large object hidden beneath a heavy tarp, dark gray and sagging in the middle like it had been untouched for years. Beside it, a stack of metal crates stood neatly aligned, labeled with fading stickers and stamp tags. A narrow shelf lined one wall holding dusty containers, folders, and old plastic reels. There were no toys, no signs of daycare function. This room had nothing to do with childcare. Atlas stayed near the threshold, watching the stillness ahead. With a kind of caution Andrew had learned to respect. This was different. The earlier hallway had spoken of secrecy, of abandonment. This room, though forgotten, was preserved. It had been built to endure. The tarp, heavy and thick, sagged as Andrew reached out and pulled it back. Beneath it was a desk, metal, wide, its surface covered with scattered papers, yellowed forms, and a vintage tape recorder coated in dust. The recorder had a small, cracked label near the speaker. It read only 2 words handwritten in fading ink, Session Archive. Andrew carefully lifted the top sheet. The paper was brittle, crumbling slightly at the corners and carried printed notes in clipped clinical language. At the top of each form was a code Haven protocol followed by a series of numbers and dates. Each page listed a subject name, estimated age, behavioral notes, and annotations marked in red pencil. They were reports, possibly medical or psychological, in nature, but deeply vague, filled with coded language and references to activities that lacked any clear meaning. The content blurred the line between institutional observation and something else, something more experimental. He sifted through the folders on the shelf. Inside were undeveloped rolls of film, microfiche slides, and tapes with labels like Observation Cycle 4 and Echo Interviews. Each piece seemed designed not for record-keeping, but for secrecy. They weren't filed. They were hidden. Each item had been placed here as if to vanish behind concrete and darkness. The metal crates bore stamps from agencies that had changed. Names decades ago, now mostly defunct or absorbed into newer federal departments. What hadn't changed was the intent behind the concealment. Atlas's ears perked as something creaked behind the shelf. A faint sound, so soft it almost passed his imagination. Andrew followed the direction of the dog's stare. Behind the lowest part of the shelf, the wall appeared uneven. He knelt and felt the stone. It was cool to the touch and slightly recessed, forming a shallow alcove. Inside was a steel latch, tucked away as if someone never meant it to be found. He pulled it gently, and a low rumble groaned through the floor. To his left, the adjacent wall split open with a slow, echoing crack. Section of the concrete retracted into itself, revealing a hidden passage, narrow, angular, and descending sharply into further darkness. The air that escaped from it was different from the others, wet, stale, and faintly metallic. Andrew felt a chill that reached deeper than the temperature could explain. Atlas stood at the entrance, unmoving, eyes locked ahead. Whatever lay beyond, this next threshold wasn't just secret. It was buried, layered beneath lies, built into the bones of the building with intention. Andrew tightened his grip on the flashlight and stepped forward. The light barely touched the curve of the tunnel, and the shadows pulled back slowly, as if reluctant to surrender what they had guarded for so long. The passageway sloped downward at a sharp angle, forcing Andrew to crouch slightly as he moved deeper into the tunnel. The concrete gave way to something rougher, walls that appeared hastily constructed, layered with old insulation and streaks of moisture clinging to their uneven surfaces. The light from his flashlight revealed patches of rust where metal beams had begun to bleed through the concrete. And in some areas, the structure looked more like an abandoned drainage channel than a planned facility. The air grew colder with every step, not just in temperature but in feeling thick and unmoving, as though the space had been sealed away for decades without ever being touched again. Atlas remained close, his steps careful, deliberate, and quiet. His tail was low, his ears pointed forward, catching every faint echo that bounced off the walls. Water dripped somewhere ahead, its rhythm erratic, a sound that broke the silence only long enough to remind Andrew how deep they had gone. The tunnel felt wrong, too narrow for comfort, too long to be accidental. It curved slightly to the left, forcing visibility to collapse into mystery. Every step was an invitation to discover something that had long tried to stay hidden. 50 feet in, the walls began to change. Thin markings appeared, etched faintly, almost as though scratched in by fingernails or crude tools. Symbols, overlapping lines, numbers arranged in patterns that meant nothing at first glance, but seemed deliberate. A repeating figure, a triangle, with a circle in the center, recurred over and over as if someone had obsessed over it. Some symbols were surrounded by tally marks, uneven in spacing and quantity. Others appeared to be initials or codes, none recognizable, beneath one set. Of symbols, the concrete had worn away as though something heavy had leaned against it for too long. The markings were not decorative. They were desperate. Eventually, the passage opened into a wider chamber, circular and domed, its walls coated in grime and mildew. The ceiling stretched high above, blackened from time or perhaps smoke, and in the center stood a strange metallic structure, something between a chair and a frame. Thick straps hung loosely from its sides, some torn, others stiff. With H around the perimeter of the chamber, more equipment stood covered in sheets, their shapes suggesting tables or cabinets. The space looked functional in some forgotten way, as if it once held purpose no one spoke about anymore. This wasn't a storage room. It was a place of action, of process. Andrew approached the center structure, circling slowly, flashlight casting warped shadows across the ground. The straps had numbers sewn into them, faded but legible. Each strap was a different size, as though meant for various arm lengths or shoulder widths. Beneath the chair, the concrete was cracked, revealing a drain, circular and rusted, surrounded by a stain that stretched out like brittle fingers. There were no lights in the ceiling, no windows. The only illumination came from the small beam he carried, barely enough to keep the corners of the room from swallowing themselves. He moved to one of the covered objects near the wall and peeled back the dust-heavy tarp. Underneath was a cabinet lined with drawers, each labeled with faded stickers and handwritten notes. He opened the top drawer and found dozens of small plastic containers, each holding what appeared to be hair clippings, fingernails, and fragments of fabric. Names were written on the lids, only first names, and many repeated ones he had seen on the hallway walls. Caleb, Marcus, Eli, Jonah. One container had no name, just the number 0. Beside the cabinet sat a box marked with red tape. Inside were journals, thin, leather-bound notebooks filled with small, cramped handwriting. Andrew flipped through one. The entries were cold and clinical, void of emotion, filled with observations of subject behavior under isolation, auditory reaction to control exposure, and physical endurance assessments under variable temperature shifts. The subjects were listed by number, not name, and the handwriting changed partway through as if taken over by another observer. These were not school records. They were documentation of experiments carried out under the same roof where children today played with blocks and sang alphabet songs. Atlas stood facing the far end of the chamber, still and focused. His body tensed as though something beyond the wall had caught his senses. Andrew stepped up beside him, and his flashlight illuminated a set of stairs tucked away behind another partial wall. They rose sharply upward, their narrow frame embedded into the concrete. The steps were steel, coated in rust, each one groaning slightly as Andrew tested it with his boot. Atlas ascended ahead, his paws quiet but purposeful, every motion revealing he expected more tunnels, more secrets, more truths buried in layers of dust and silence. The stairs led them to another narrow hall, dim and low ceiling, this time with ventilation pipes running above their heads. A low hum could be heard faintly now, machinery still running somewhere far off. The hallway curved sharply before ending at a single thick steel door bolted shut from the inside. There were marks on the floor, scuff patterns, drag lines, traces of movement preserved in grime. Andrew's hand hovered over the bolt, heart pounding not from fear, but from the growing weight of discovery. Whatever lay beyond that door was not only the answer to everything they'd seen so far. It was something that was never meant to be found. And Atlas, never looking away from the steel, let out a slow, trembling breath. The bolt released with a metallic clank, the sound sharp and final as it echoed down the tight corridor behind them. Andrew stepped back momentarily, steadying himself before pulling the thick steel door open. The hinges groaned in protest, reluctant to part with their burden after years of silence. Cold air spilled from the newly revealed space, rolling across. The floor like fog stirred from an ancient cavern. The scent that followed was unlike anything he had encountered inside the tunnels. Mildly chemical, tinged with something sterile yet unsettling, as if bleach had been poured over decay in an attempt to erase its origin. Atlas hesitated only for a breath, then entered first, his movements deliberate and silent. The flashlight beam reached forward into the void, cutting through the MC to reveal a room unlike any they had seen thus far. It was rectangular, its floor a polished, waxed concrete that reflected light with unnatural sharpness. The walls were smooth and painted a muted gray, free from markings, grime, or decay. Everything here had been maintained recently and deliberately. At the far end stood a control panel built into the wall, its screen dark, covered in dust, yet clearly intact. Beneath it was a desk with an array of drawers and unlabeled binders. Along one side of the room, a row of sealed containers sat arranged like silent sentinels. Large, cylindrical, each with locking mechanisms and digital keypads, now lifeless. A heavy glass window covered nearly half of one wall, allowing a view into the adjacent room. That space was darker, less defined, a hollow square encased in observation glass, and it carried a terrible stillness. Andrew approached it slowly, his eyes adjusting to the gloom behind the barrier. The room on the other side appeared to be an isolation chamber, plain, cold, with a single chair bolted into the center of the floor. The walls bore deep scratches, some trailing downward as if made by fingernails or claws. The floor had circular indentations surrounding the chair, possibly for restraints or sensors. Above the chair, a small dome hung from the ceiling, a camera or some other instrument now long inactive. Andrew stepped closer to the glass, pressing his palm gently against it. The surface was cool and unyielding. A faint fingerprint smudge remained on the other side. Just one positioned at chest level, its edges blurred by time. It was not the sterile kind of print left by someone in gloves or a technician. It was human, small, and likely made by a hand reaching for help. For a long moment, the silence thickened again, and a weight settled in Andrew's chest. A pressure born not of fear, but of realization. This place had not been abandoned. It had been hidden. Its purpose wasn't lost to time. It had simply been sealed away before anyone could question it. Atlas moved toward one of the sealed containers. Along the wall, sniffing its base before circling once and sitting with his back rigid. His ears twitched and his stare remained fixed on the unit as if waiting for movement or sound. Andrew approached it slowly, eyes scanning for markings. The container bore a serial number stamped near the top, the digits half faded but partially legible. No manufacturer, no agency, no hint of what might lie inside. The keypad's lights were off and the handle locked in place. He didn't attempt to open it. The structure looked sound, and there was no telling what might still be active inside. He turned back to the desk beneath the control panel. The top drawer opened easily, revealing several plastic badges, each bearing a faded photograph and title. None of the faces were familiar, but each carried a cold professionalism, unsiling, posed, detached. One badge stood out, not because of its title or name, but because of a handwritten sticker across its surface. It read, "No clearance." Andrew flipped it over. There was no barcode, no embedded chip. It wasn't meant for access. It was meant to mark exclusion. Someone who had once worked here but had been locked out from the full truth. Inside the second drawer, he found what he hadn't expected. Audio tapes. Not digital drives or video reels, but small labeled cassettes wrapped in brittle rubber bands. Each was marked with dates, some decades old. One tape, older than the rest, carried a single word written in black ink across its face: initiation. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his palm, as if holding a voice long silenced. There was no player in sight, but his next steps were already forming. This tape wasn't archived by mistake. It was stored here to wait. From the far corner of the room, behind another partial divider, Atlas let out a low growl, not aggressive, but alert, as though something beyond had begun to stir. Andrew's flashlight swung in the direction of the sound, revealing another hallway, short, narrow, and leading toward a reinforced door with a red light blinking faintly above it. This light was the first sign of power they had seen, and power meant something was still awake. The faint red light above the steel door pulsed in a steady rhythm, casting a dull, bleeding glow onto the hallway floor. It was the only active light source in the entire underground complex, and its presence felt intrusive, almost like a heartbeat echoing in a place where nothing should be alive. Andrew moved forward cautiously, his flashlight beam steady, scanning the narrow passage that led to the final door. Each footstep was muted, softened by the cold concrete and the deep quiet pressing in from all sides. Atlas walked slightly ahead, body tense but silent, his focus locked on the door as if the source of every strange scent and sound led there. The reinforced steel stood taller and thicker than any of the previous doors. A narrow viewing slit had been welded shut, the seams fused by thick lines of solder that suggested urgency and secrecy. Just above the handle, a keypad sat embedded into the wall, dead, the screen dark and cracked. The red light came from a small indicator just above the keypad wired into the frame with exposed cables. There was no access panel, no visible override switch, and no clear way in. It was as if the door had been designed not to open, but simply to be sealed forever. Andrew circled the door slowly, inspecting the frame, the hinges, the floor around. Its base? Fine dust had settled along the seam undisturbed, except for a faint groove, one that suggested it had opened more recently than the rest of the facility. Something or someone had passed through. Atlas sniffed along the lower edge of the door, then sat still, head low, listening. The hum of power behind the door was faint but unmistakable. It vibrated in the walls, barely perceptible, but constant. Andrew pressed his hand against the cold metal. It thrummed softly beneath his palm, as though machinery deep within the room was still running. He stepped back, letting the flashlight sweep once more across the hallway. To the left, recessed into the wall, was a control junction, small, rusted, and sealed behind a scratched plexiglass cover. He pried it open and found a tangle of wires running to a manual circuit breaker. Dust clung to every surface, but the switch was newer than the rest, its surface scraped from repeated use. He flipped it upward, a jolt surged through the floor, faint but real. The keypad on the door blinked, then glowed faintly with an amber hue, flickering like a candle, struggling to stay lit. Digits scrolled across the display briefly, then stopped on a prompt. No code was offered, but below the screen was a button labeled Override, its edges worn by each. Andrew hesitated, then pressed it. The light above the door flashed once, then went solid. A locking mechanism deep within the wall clicked, and the door shifted ever so slightly in its frame. Not open, but unlocked. Atlas rose immediately, his tail stiffening, his ears perked toward the slight change in air pressure that followed. Andrew pulled the handle. The door resisted for a moment, then gave way with a long metallic groan. The air that escaped was colder than the rest, thick and heavy, saturated with chemicals and time. The flashlight beam cut through it, revealing a wide, low-ceiling chamber beyond. The walls were lined with vertical lockers, each labeled with codes, not names. The floor was divided into squares, grid-like, each with embedded ports or vents. It resembled a decontamination bay or perhaps a testing facility, though stripped of any clear function. At the center of the room stood a glass enclosure, large, reinforced, and fogged on the inside. Cables ran from its base into the floor, trailing beneath access panels and disappearing into darkness. Beside it stood a rusted console, inactive, but intact. Atlas remained by Andrew's side. No longer leading, no longer pulling. His stance had shifted, not from fear, but from recognition, as if he understood what they had entered. The space was quiet, yet something about it felt loud, filled with echoes of actions no one had ever witnessed, preserved in silence and steel. Andrew circled the glass enclosure. The interior, partially obscured by condensation, showed faint outlines, shelves, a seat, some kind of internal framework. No body, no movement. But inside the glass, carved crudely into the lower section of the wall, were lines, names scratched by fingernails or tools, dozens of them. One stood out among the others, deeper and clearer. Jonah, a name from the hallway, a name that kept returning, a name not meant to be forgotten. The flashlight flickered. Andrew tapped it, restoring the beam. Behind him, the console chirped faintly, a soft sound just once. The screen glowed dim blue, unprompted. Lines of text scrolled briefly, stopping on a phrase that chilled the air even further. Protocol hold released. Below that, A timer began to count upward from 0. Atlas turned toward the corridor they had come from, ears twitching, eyes alert. In the distance, deeper in the underground warren of hidden rooms and buried purpose, a distant clang echoed through the walls. Metal striking metal, steady, rhythmic, deliberate. Something had just woken up. The sound continued. Metal on metal, rhythmic and slow, echoing faintly through the underground corridors like a pendulum tolling in a forgotten cathedral. Each clang seemed to carry with it a pulse of air, subtle but real, as if the deep foundation of the building had begun to shift under some ancient weight. Andrew stood frozen for a moment, the soft glow of the console's blue screen behind him, and the steady breath of Atlas at his side. The only signs of life in a chamber that felt otherwise untouched by time or memory. The timer on the screen kept counting upward, second by second, unbothered by the silence surrounding it. He turned toward the corridor from which they had entered, but the shadows had deepened there. The flashlight in his hand flickered again, its power waning. He shook it gently, the beam sputtering back to life, weaker than before. He didn't like the change in the air. It felt not just cooler but charged, as though something invisible had been stirred from slumber. Its presence too heavy to name, but too real to ignore. Atlas began to walk slowly back toward the door, glancing behind him every few steps, as if unsure whether to stay or retreat. The hesitation in the dog's movements was unsettling. It was rare to see him pause, let alone reconsider. The door remained open behind them, but the red light above had changed. It no longer blinked. Now it glowed steadily as if watching. Andrew stepped into the hallway, his boots silent against the concrete, trying to follow the faint direction of the sound. The clanging had grown softer, but it was still there, distant yet deliberate, each strike spaced evenly, like the ticking of an unseen mechanism. He advanced down the corridor with Atlas close beside him, the air tightening around them with every turn. Lights embedded in the wall, dormant before, now blinked faintly in sequence, their glow shifting from amber to green as they passed, illuminating sections of the path that had previously vanished into shadow. As they moved, the corridor widened slightly. Doors began to reappear, some sealed shut, others open just a crack. One room they passed had walls lined with padded panels. The floor littered with small plastic tiles bearing letters and numbers, scattered like forgotten lessons. Another room was filled with rusted beds, each neatly made as though awaiting children who would never return. The air was dry but dense with memory. Atlas paused at each threshold, sniffing once, then continuing on. His pace quickened near the end of the hall, his body pulling slightly forward, his instincts sharpening. They turned a final corner, and the source of the noise became clear. At the end of the hall stood a large steel gate, wide and heavily reinforced. One of the lower bolts had already begun to shift, slowly retracting into the wall with a mechanical groan. The top bolt followed, grinding with difficulty as if the mechanisms powering it had not been used in decades. Between the gates, a narrow line of pale light shone through, spilling onto the floor like a path drawn in chalk. Beyond the barrier, a shadow moved, slow and indistinct, large but not yet fully seen. Atlas tensed, his hackles rising, his muscles tightening like coiled wire. He let out a low, restrained growl, not of fear but of warning. Andrew raised his flashlight again, trying to focus its fading beam through the crack in the gate. What he saw was no clearer than before, but enough to know that someone or something was inside that room. Not an object, not machinery, a presence, human in form perhaps, but wrong in posture and stillness. It stood just beyond the light, unmoving, as if waiting for permission to step forward. The control panel beside the gate flickered. A soft chime sounded. Text scrolled quickly across a display too dim to read. Then abruptly, all lights along the corridor dimmed together, plunging the space into near total darkness. The only remaining light came from the narrow line between the gates and the faint glow of the console behind them, now too far to illuminate their path. Andrew did not move. Neither did Atlas. The silence returned so absolute it felt as if the entire facility had inhaled and refused to exhale. And then without warning, the gate began to slide open, Not fast, not chaotic. It moved with slow purpose, revealing the room beyond in fragments. A sterile chamber with glass walls, dim blue light lining the floor, and rows of empty chairs bolted to the ground like an auditorium for ghosts. The figure at the center remained still, shrouded in half shadow, but something in the air changed once more, less like fear, more like recognition. Atlas stepped forward first, one slow step onto the light-streaked concrete. His eyes never left the figure. Andrew followed, hand tightening on the flashlight, even as its light began to die. Whatever this chamber had once held, it remembered them. The steel gate came to a full stop with a final grinding clunk, locking itself open with eerie finality. The chamber beyond now stood exposed, fully lit by low, cold beams running along the base of the walls. The light cast long shadows against the floor and made everything within the room appear suspended, caught between existence and memory. Andrew stepped cautiously inside, flashlight still in hand, though its beam had dimmed to a flicker. He scanned the interior slowly, taking in each detail as though trying to decipher the meaning behind every fixture, every arrangement, every surface that remained untouched by time, yet saturated in something deeper than dust. Atlas moved with precision, sniffing the air as he followed a looping path that kept him close to Andrew's side. The dog's body was rigid, but his head swiveled constantly, absorbing scents and signals unseen by human senses. The room was unlike the others. This was not a storage bay or containment corridor. It was constructed with intentional symmetry, almost ritualistic in its geometry. For rows of chairs bolted to the floor and facing inward toward a central platform suggested some kind of gathering. Each chair had a harness, its straps coiled neatly as if ready for another session. No dust covered the seats. No signs of age dulled their surfaces. They had either been cleaned or used recently. The figure they had glimpsed through the gate now stood fully visible at the far end of the chamber. It was a man, at least what appeared to be one, tall, dressed in a faded gray jumpsuit and facing away from them toward a wall of blank glass. His hands were at his sides, fingers slightly curled. He made no move to acknowledge their presence, no sign that he was surprised or disturbed. The outline of his form was unsettling not for any grotesque detail, but because of its stillness, so rigid it bordered on inhuman. Not frozen from fear or paralysis, but held in place by choice or design. Andrew advanced slowly, letting his steps fall in measured intervals, careful not to break the silence with sudden noise. The walls on either side bore faint traces of markings, indented symbols, and codes partially erased or sanded down. In one corner of the room, a discarded cart sat turned on its side, its contents spilled. A cluster of sealed vials, wires, and what looked like a pair of observation lenses attached to a head harness. Nearby, a medical tray held dull instruments, laid out in precise rows. None bore blood or residue, but each piece seemed out of place, too clinical for comfort. As they drew closer to the figure, Atlas stopped moving. The dog crouched low, ears tilted forward, muscles tight. His gaze locked on the man, and he let out a breathy huff, not a growl, but a signal. Andrew held his flashlight higher, its beam flickering across the man's back. The jumpsuit bore a number stitched into the collar 34. No name, no agency, just the digits, plain and anonymous. The skin at the back of his neck was pale, hair clipped short, the color hard to distinguish in the blue light. Andrew said nothing, but his instincts had begun to scream. Not fear, but the unmistakable sensation that they were standing in front of something that should not be here, or perhaps never should have been left behind. Suddenly the lights dimmed. For a single moment, not enough to darken the room, but enough to send a pulse through the floor. One Andrew could feel in his boots. A low vibration hummed beneath them, subtle, but spreading outward in every direction. The man in the jumpsuit shifted his right foot just slightly and raised his hand to the glass. He placed his palm flat against it, pressing gently. A soft ring emitted from the panel behind him, followed by a click. A section of the wall beside him opened with mechanical precision, revealing a passage Andrew hadn't seen before. It led into total darkness, swallowing even the edges of the light bleeding from the chamber. The man didn't enter it. He simply turned toward Andrew slowly, revealing a face that was pale, narrow, and expressionless. His eyes were sunken, but clear, locked onto Andrew's face with eerie familiarity. He wasn't confused. He wasn't hostile. He seemed to be waiting. His arms remained by his side, body language unreadable. Then, in one deliberate movement, he stepped back from the wall and began walking toward the chairs, each step echoing softly, untouched by hesitation. He took a seat in the exact center and looked directly at Atlas. Atlas did not react, not with aggression, not with fear. He stared back, unmoving, as though recognizing something buried beneath memory. Andrew watched, unsure whether he was witnessing a performance or the continuation of something long paused. The man did not blink. He did not speak. He simply waited. From the far corridor beyond the open wall, another soft sound emerged. Not mechanical, not footsteps, but breathing, labored and slow. Whatever had been started here, it wasn't over. The sound of breathing echoed through the open passage like a fragile rhythm carried by the bones of the building itself. Each inhale was drawn with strain, followed by a prolonged exhale that hinted at weariness, not just of body, but of time. It was not the breath of someone startled or panicked, but of something or someone deeply anchored in the underground silence. Andrew stood motionless, torn between stepping into the corridor or remaining inside the chamber where the man in the jumpsuit now sat unmoving. The man had not shifted since taking his place, and his gaze remained locked forward, eyes hollow, yet deliberate, fixed on something invisible yet clearly real to him. Atlas stayed beside Andrew, his posture rigid and head tilted toward the dark corridor. The low breathing grew slightly louder, still paced, but now joined by a faint clicking, sound like fingernails tapping rhythmically against metal. It didn't echo like footsteps. It repeated in a mechanical beat matched evenly with the breaths. The corridor itself remained cloaked in pitch blackness, the edges of the doorway seemingly consuming the light from the chamber. Andrew raised the flashlight again, though its beam had weakened to a pale shimmer, barely reaching beyond the threshold. Still, he stepped forward, each movement measured, his body tensed beneath his uniform. Atlas followed, silent and alert, paws making no sound as they crossed onto the cold floor of the passage. The temperature dropped sharply, pressing against. Their skin and fur-like water pulled from deep underground. The walls on either side narrowed slightly, curving inward as if forming a funnel, drawing them deeper. Every few feet, small vents in the ceiling exhaled slow drafts of chilled air, each blast followed by a faint chime that hinted at a long, deactivated ventilation system flickering back to life. The breath and clicks continued ahead of them, always just beyond reach, never closer yet never fading. As they progressed, thin panels embedded in the wall lit up one by one, triggered by proximity or weight. Each panel displayed fragments of data, codes, images, rotating diagrams. One showed a child's handprint outlined in red with the word inactive flashing across it. Another displayed a rotating 3D model of a human skull annotated with strange labels and highlighted zones across the brain. The images were clinical, emotionless, but the implication behind them felt heavier than any words. These were records likely left behind not to inform, but to be forgotten. The hallway curved again, and the air grew heavier. Ahead, the passage opened into a chamber that was vastly different from all the others. The floor was glass, thick and reinforced, suspended over a hollow pit below. Dozens of small lights shone upward from beneath the glass, casting sharp shadows across the ceiling. In the center of the room was a large circular tank filled with a clear fluid that shimmered with a faint green hue. Suspended inside was something vaguely humanoid, curled in a fetal position, its skin pale and translucent as though still forming. Wires extended from its back, arms, and legs, disappearing into ports along the tank's interior. Its eyes were closed. Its chest rose and fell with the same rhythm as the breathing sound they had followed. Around the chamber, workstations stood, abandoned. Terminals blinked faintly, displaying rotating logs, pause timelines, and streaming data loops. The machinery continued to run despite the absence of operators. This part of the facility hadn't been shut down. It had been left behind mid-function. Andrew approached the tank slowly, flashlight reflecting against the curved glass. As he reached its base, he saw the creature's eyes open. They were bright, not with color but with depth, unfamiliar yet intelligent. Staring straight through the glass with an awareness that startled him to his core, Atlas did not bark. He did not growl. He sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the figure, as though encountering not a threat but a presence worthy of respect. The breathing inside the tank grew louder, though its cadence remained the same. A nearby monitor lit up and began printing text one word at a time. Subject Jonah, vital signs stable, integration paused. The next line followed in sequence. Last observed interaction K943, handler unknown. Andrew looked at Atlas, whose tag read exactly that. K9-43. The connections snapped into place like a puzzle piece long hidden under dust and fear. Whatever had happened here, whatever they were meant to forget, was not buried beneath time. It had waited, kept alive by code, silence, and memory. The tank's fluid began to pulse faintly with light as if responding to presence. More text appeared on the screen. Awaiting reactivation command. Andrew took a step back, not out of fear, but because he understood this wasn't just about a hidden chamber. It was about a decision made years ago, one that had been left behind without closure, and now it was waking up again. A low vibration passed beneath Andrew's boots as the fluid in the tank began to ripple, the light within pulsing in measured intervals like the beat of a distant drum. The figure suspended inside remained motionless, its limbs relaxed but its eyes wide open, unmoving yet unmistakably aware. The wires trailing from its body twitched gently, as if reacting to the energy coursing through the chamber. The tank emitted a deep mechanical hum, subtle at first, but steadily rising in volume. Around the perimeter of the room, the dormant monitors came alive one by one, each displaying a different sequence of data. Heartbeat graphs, chemical charts, skeletal overlays, and lines of rapidly scrolling code that changed too quickly to decipher. Atlas remained seated, but alert, ears high, gaze never leaving the face inside the glass. There was no sign of fear in the dog's posture, only curiosity edged with recognition. Andrew backed a few steps, scanning the control panels lining the outer wall of the chamber. Each interface blinked with old software screens, their designs outdated but fully functional. One displayed a large red button labeled Hold, its outline glowing faintly. Below it, a second prompt appeared. This one green labeled Resume. The words were simple, but their weight hung heavy. A terminal nearby displayed an internal log, entries stretching back decades, each recorded with precision. The entries were titled not with names but with designations. Subject 01 through Subject 37. Every record included observations, tests, reactions, and eventual status closures. Most of the subjects were marked as unresponsive, rejected, or terminated. Only one remained active. Subject 34 Tona. His timeline did not end, it stopped. The final entry read only transfer to long-term chamber initiated. K9 match confirmed. Status dormant pending external stimulus. Andrew stepped closer to the screen, drawn to the final words, K9 match. He looked once again at Atlas, who now stood, tail low, but eyes sharp, stepping closer to the tank. The moment the dog neared, the heartbeat monitor spiked slightly, the line jumping before settling into a new rhythm. Inside the tank, the figure's chest expanded deeper, as if pulling in its first true breath. Its mouth opened slightly, then closed. No words, no movement, but unmistakable life. The connection was undeniable. This wasn't just a forgotten subject. It was a bond that had survived beyond understanding. An imprint burned into the instincts of the creature within and the canine standing beside it. Atlas placed his paw against the glass gently, and as he did, the lights overhead flickered once, casting a blue shimmer across the chamber. The figure responded in kind, raising one hand slowly. pressing its palm against the inside of the tank, directly across from Atlas. At that moment, a deep click echoed from the ceiling. A portion of the roof began to shift, mechanical arms descending and locking onto the top of the tank. Steam hissed as the pressure seal around the glass casing began to release. A voice, hollow and mechanical, crackled through an unseen speaker. One word only, spoken with sterile clarity. Authorization accepted. Warning lights blinked red for a brief instant, then shifted back to white. The fluid began to drain from the tank through hidden channels at its base, gurgling away as the body inside gently descended and came to rest at the bottom. The glass receded upward, disappearing into the ceiling. What was once enclosed was now open. The figure, now fully visible, remained crouched, its back arched, skin pale, and faintly luminous under the cold artificial lights. Atlas stepped forward again, unblinking, and stopped only inches from the motionless form. The figure raised its head, revealing a face both youthful and impossibly weary. Its eyes met Andrew's, and something passed between them. Not words, not thoughts, but the undeniable knowledge that something ancient had been stitched back together in that moment. Something broken, waiting to heal or finish what it had been created to do. The figure tried to stand but stumbled slightly, hands finding the floor for balance. Andrew rushed forward instinctively, not out of duty, but from something deeper. An unspoken connection he could not name. He reached out, offering steadying support. The skin beneath his grip was cold but pulsing with warmth. The sensation like touching an echo of life just beginning to resurface. The figure leaned on him for a second, then straightened. The monitors behind them dimmed, their screens now displaying only a single symbol, a circle within a triangle, glowing softly. Below it, the word recalibration appeared, counting upward in slow, deliberate seconds. Then came another sound, a long metallic groan from somewhere above. The ceiling plates shifted again, but this time it wasn't a release. It was an opening. A shaft extended downward, revealing a lift system embedded into the walls. A platform began to lower, its edges lined with embedded lights, stopping gently at the far side of the chamber. The way out had revealed itself, but what waited above had yet to be understood. The platform remained still, its surface smooth and dustless, as though it had been cleaned not by hands but by time itself. A low hum resonated beneath it, like a sleeping engine, gently stirring. Above the shaft, a narrow tunnel stretched upward, vanishing into darkness beyond the reach of Andrew's failing flashlight. A faint breeze drifted down the corridor, carrying with it the scent of the world outside. Soil, rain, and something harder to define, like burned metal mixed with age. The smell wasn't strong, but it was unmistakable. It did not belong to the sterile chambers of this underground facility. It belonged to the city above, where children played and daylight ruled. Yet that contrast only deepened the unease that clung to the air. Jonah, no longer suspended, but now standing upright on unsteady legs, turned his face upward, drawn toward the shaft like a flower, sensing light through cracks in concrete. His expression was unreadable, neither fear, nor hope, nor memory, but something caught in between. His body was slim, the skin almost translucent beneath the artificial glow, but strength seemed to ripple just beneath its surface, like wires stretched too tight. Every motion he made felt practiced, controlled, as though instinct guided muscles that the mind had not yet reclaimed. Atlas stood beside him now, not guarding or questioning, but accompanying. The bond was no longer silent. It pulsed visibly in their synchronized movements, in the subtle shifts of breath and balance, in the way they responded to the space as one. Andrew watched them both carefully, his thoughts tangled in the unraveling mystery. He had come expecting to check a daycare building for a simple anomaly, a scratched floor and a barking dog. Now he stood inside a buried sanctuary that had held a secret no one was meant to remember. He stepped onto the platform, boots clicking softly on the metal surface. The vibration underfoot was steady, almost soothing in its rhythm. Jonah followed, bare feet making no sound, and Atlas moved into place at Andrew's side. The moment the three stood in place, a light above the shaft flickered to life. A soft tone sounded, and the platform began to rise, not fast, but with precise motion, as if elevation were less about escape and more about ritual. The walls around them glowed faintly as they passed. Layers of conduits, rusted bolts, and reinforced. Steel painted in long, faded emergency markings. Every foot they climbed felt like shedding the weight of years buried beneath secrets. As the lift descended, the air changed. It warmed slightly, growing less sterile, less machine-pressed. The oppressive silence gave way to ambient noise. The distant creaks of the building's bones, the faint hum of traffic far above. Andrew felt his heartbeat grow louder in his chest, not from exertion, but from anticipation. They were returning to a world that had no idea what slept beneath it. Jonah stared upward, the lights casting shadows across his face that made him look both younger and impossibly older. He did not speak, but something about the way his eyes tracked every bolt, every scene, suggested familiarity. This path had once been his, or at least belonged to others like him. After what felt like several stories, the platform slowed, coming to rest beneath a large steel. Great, the surface was disguised to match the tile flooring of the daycare, faint scuff marks revealing the illusion's age. A mechanism whirred above, then clicked as the grate split and folded open like petals, revealing the underside of the facility's main floor. Dim sunlight streamed through dusty vents, casting muted beams into the shaft below. For a moment, all three remained still. Then Atlas stepped forward, his paws landing softly on the floor above. Jonah followed, emerging into the light like someone stepping through a veil. Andrew climbed out last, blinking against the shift in light and scent. The room they now entered was familiar. It had once been a playroom. The wall still bore faded crayon drawings, the floor littered with forgotten toys. But now everything looked different. The quiet was too perfect, the colors too faded. It felt less like a daycare and more like a preserved memory, frozen at the moment it was sealed shut. Behind them, the grate sealed with a whisper, vanishing into the floor once more. No evidence remained of the path they had taken. No hatch. No door, just tile scuffed and worn as if 100 little feet had once danced across it. Then from the hallway just beyond, a sound approached. Slow, measured footsteps and the clink of keys. Someone else was here, and they had no idea what was standing in the room. The soft creak of the hallway door was followed by the slow jingle of keys. Casual and unaware, like the kind of sound that belonged to someone locking up after hours, not someone entering a forgotten place pulsing with secrets. The footsteps were steady, unhurried, echoing faintly through the hallway just beyond the playroom. They came closer with each second, unaware that what waited inside was no child's story, no ordinary space, but a truth buried so deeply it was never meant to rise again. The faint rustling of fabric and the hollow clap of shoes against the floor made the moment unbearably tense. A single wrong move could shift the balance between remaining hidden and sparking a reckoning that no one was prepared to face. Jonah stood in the soft light with eyes locked on the open door. He did not retreat, nor did he posture with threat. His expression remained still, unreadable, as though waiting for something. Perhaps recognition, or perhaps the inevitable breach between past and present. Atlas was silent beside him, tail held low, ears forward, every inch of his body humming with quiet awareness. The atmosphere was so delicate it seemed the very walls had learned to hold their breath. The moment felt stretched, every second drawn out as though time itself hesitated to move forward. Andrew stayed behind both of them, positioned slightly. Off to the side, heart pounding hard enough to blur the edges of his hearing, he knew the layout of the daycare by now. The hallway connected the playroom to the side exit and the staff office. The figure approaching was most likely a janitor or one of the afternoon security staff. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual, but the problem was not who they were. It was what they were about to see. The door creaked open slowly, a silhouette. Emerging in the frame, the man was middle-aged, wearing a navy jacket and holding a clipboard. He paused the moment he saw them, eyes adjusting slowly to the light. First, his gaze landed on Andrew. Then, with growing confusion, it drifted to the boy standing silently in the center of the room. Jonah's skin caught the light in a strange way, as if he were lit from within. His clothes, thin and neutral, looked like a costume from a hospital or an experiment, something meant for containment, not comfort. The man blinked, took a slow step backward. His keys jingled again, but this time with hesitation. No words were spoken, but the air cracked with tension. Jonah took a single step forward. Not threatening, simply deliberate. The man's body responded immediately, shoulders tightening, hand gripping the clipboard harder, breath hitching in a way that betrayed a deep subconscious fear. He had seen something, or perhaps remembered. Andrew moved slightly into his line of sight, attempting to bridge the growing chasm between logic and panic, but the damage had already been done. The eyes of the man in the doorway now reflected something deeper than confusion, recognition, in that split second. Everything that had been hidden below ground came crashing upward, not through noise or motion, but through the irreversible weight of being seen. Jonah paused again, sensing the shift, and looked directly at the man. The hallway light flickered behind him, casting elongated shadows along the floor. The clipboard slipped from his hand and struck the tile with a hollow clatter that echoed through the building like a bell. He turned and ran. His footsteps thundered down the corridor, growing fainter as he fled the building without even bothering to shut the door behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. A new layer of reality had been peeled away. The story was no longer contained within steel and concrete. It had spilled upward into daylight, into the waking world where whispers could no longer be smothered. Andrew stepped forward, walking to the door, watching through the glass as the man sprinted across the parking lot toward the security vehicle parked near the fence. The man fumbled with his phone, likely dialing numbers that would open more doors than anyone wanted. Andrew's instincts urged him to follow, to explain, to do something to stem what had just begun. But behind him, he heard Jonah move again, turning away from the door, facing inward. The boy, if he could even still be called that, stood in the middle of the room, staring at the crayon drawings on the wall. One of them, a faint image of a stick figure beside a four-legged shape, had been drawn years ago in trembling lines. Jonah touched the drawing gently, brushing his fingers across the colors as though remembering something he could not fully grasp. Then, without a sound, he turned toward the back hallway, walking calmly through the playroom as if he already knew where he needed to go next. Atlas followed him, not with command, but with quiet resolve. And Andrew, knowing the moment had shattered everything, turned to follow them too, toward the part of the building where the truth had been painted over the walls and forgotten in silence. The hallway at the back of the daycare had always felt strangely narrow, its ceiling a few inches lower than the rest of the building, the walls lined with bulletin boards now curling at the corners. But today, with Jonah walking its length, each step seemed to wake something buried within the drywall and the beams above. The lights flickered in sequence, not from age or faulty wiring, but as if responding to his presence, flaring briefly, then dimming like eyes blinking in confusion. The building itself was beginning to remember. Every tile beneath their feet held echoes of what had been concealed. And with each step Jonah took, the whispers became louder, not in sound, but in sensation, like a current running just beneath the surface of everything ordinary. Atlas walked beside him with slow, careful movements, his head low, breathing steady. The hallway smelled of dry wood, aging carpet glue, and something else rising from the cracks. A trace of the sterile underground air still clinging to Jonah's skin. Andrew followed close behind, uncertain if he was escorting Jonah or being led by him. The boy hadn't spoken, hadn't even gestured, but the path seemed mapped out inside him. He moved as though the turns and corners weren't discovered, but remembered. They reached the far end of the corridor where a faded emergency exit sign hung above a door painted the same dull color as the walls. The knob turned easily. No resistance. As the door creaked open, it revealed not an exit, but a long-forgotten storage room filled with shelves lined with sealed boxes and abandoned furniture. It looked like nothing more than a dumping ground for old supplies, mats, broken chairs, faded picture books. But Jonah walked through it with purpose, navigating between stacks without pause. In the far corner, where the wall met the floor beneath, a partially collapsed bookshelf, there was a rectangular outline, subtle but not random. A trapdoor. The seams had been painted over, but time had not erased them completely. Jonah knelt beside it and placed his hand flat on the wood. No noise followed. No mechanism moved, but something shifted, a creak from within, like hinges, yawning after a long sleep. Atlas tensed, staring down at the hatch. Then slowly the panel lifted, rising a few inches on its own before settling back slightly as if waiting for final permission. Andrew moved forward, pulling it open the rest of the way. Beneath was a short flight of stairs, descending into a space not listed on any blueprint. The air pouring from below was colder, sharper, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wet metal and age. Jonah descended first, barefoot steps, silent on the concrete. Atlas followed, paws tapping lightly. Andrew hesitated at the threshold, then descended after them, letting the trapdoor fall shut above him. The staircase was short but tight, pressing inward as they went down. At the bottom, the passage opened into a narrow corridor with concrete walls smeared faintly with chalk drawings. Crude childlike images of faces, dogs, and tall figures with outstretched arms. Some had been partially scrubbed away, others had faded on their own. None of them were joyful. The corridor led to a small circular room no more than 15 feet across. At its center sat a metal pedestal low to the ground with a cracked screen embedded in its face. Around the perimeter were 6 small chairs bolted to the floor, each one facing inward. The ceiling was domed, lined with tiny, burnt-out lights. A single camera hung upside down from the center of the ceiling, its lens shattered and caked with dust. The place was more than hidden. It had been buried beneath denial. Jonah stood in the center of the room and stared up at the ceiling. Then, slowly he turned in a full circle, examining each wall as though matching what he saw with something deep in memory. He moved toward the pedestal and touched it. The screen sputtered. It buzzed. Then it lit up with a flash of static before displaying a single word, initiate. Atlas let out a low exhale, and the room grew still again. Jonah stepped back, and the lights around the dome flickered, one by one from left to right before fading into darkness again. Then the pedestal began to sink slowly into the floor, revealing beneath it a hollow cylinder filled with cracked data drives, tattered documents, and a row of worn identification tags. Andrew stepped forward and picked one. Up, it read, Handler the Holloway K943. Another tag lay beside it. Subject 34, Jonah. The final one was scorched and unreadable. He looked back at Jonah, who had now moved toward the wall, placing his hand on one of the old chalk drawings. A child beside a dog, both with open eyes staring upward. Something in. The room stirred. Not a machine, not a sound, but something human. The hollow beneath the pedestal had revealed more than relics. It had exposed something buried not in soil, but in silence. The data drives inside the cylinder weren't merely storage devices. They pulsed faintly with embedded power, their edges warm to the touch, as if the information inside had never stopped living. Each device bore initials etched along the sides, names that no longer existed in any record above ground. But it was the final object resting beneath the drives that held the weight of the room. The remnants of a journal, its pages fused at the edges by time and heat. The cover bore no title, only the imprint of a handprint, slightly smaller than an adult's, pressed so hard into the material that it left behind a permanent shape. Jonah's sighs. The room felt tighter now, as though the space had inhaled sharply. The moment truth began to rise, the air thickened with something invisible but undeniably present. Not fear, not memory, something older, something that had waited with patience no human could hold. Jonah stood motionless, his hands still resting. On the wall, fingers tracing the outline of the chalk figures like he was trying to reassemble something broken long ago. The figures drawn on the concrete were not random. They formed a sequence, a pattern. They were part of a map that only a child might understand or one who had never truly left that place in time. as Andrew crouched beside the remnants in the open cylinder. His fingers brushed across one of the data drives. The moment skin metal, a sudden pulse surged through the room. The lights around the ceiling flickered erratically, then steadied into a dull red glow. The broken camera above them rotated once on its mount, clicking into a new position. A tone played soft, high-pitched, almost like a lullaby turned mechanical. Then a voice broke through, fragmented and low, as though it were stitched together from decades-old recordings. Final session incomplete. Subject 34. Memory restoration pending. Handler authorization required. The room responded to the words not with movement, but with presence. Andrew felt the shift in his chest like something stirring beneath the ribs. Atlas stood at attention, head tilted toward the ceiling, fur bristling down his spine. Jonah turned toward the pedestal again, stepping forward as the remnants of the journal began to lift slightly from the hollow, suspended by magnetic force. Hovering in the stale air, its pages, once fused, now peeled open one by one. On each spread, a memory, images, not photographs but impressions. Sketches done in crayon and pen, layered with code symbols, notes written in two different hands, one child, one clinical. The voice returned, this time clearer. K9 imprint locked. Synchronization level 87%. Subject emotional baseline stable. The meaning struck hard. This had never been an experiment about biology or obedience. It was about imprinting, memory transfer, emotional anchoring. Jonah had not been trained. He had been bonded. He wasn't raised as a subject. He had been raised alongside a dog-like. Atlas, a former K9 long gone or long erased. But the pattern had remained. That's why Atlas had responded. That's why the system still recognized him. He wasn't a replacement. He was the echo of the original. Jonah's eyes fluttered shut for a moment and the air around him changed. Not just colder, but sharper, as if it cut through everything unspoken. His fingers tightened into a fist. And for the first time, something stirred behind his expression. Not confusion, not disconnection, but clarity. The room had stopped breathing. Every wire embedded in the walls, every broken bulb and silent. Speaker, all seemed to hold still in reverence for what had just returned. Jonah turned to face Andrew fully, no longer a puzzle of gestures and silence. The weight in his eyes spoke of something older than the boy he appeared to be, something layered in time and pain and fragmented recall. Then from the center of the pedestal, the journal turned its final page, revealing a name written over and over again, Daniel Holloway. Beside it, a drawing of a child holding the leash of a German shepherd with sharp eyes and a badge around its neck. It was not a test subject, it was a memory. Andrew felt the ground beneath his feet shift, not physically, but in understanding. The story wasn't just about Jonah. It was about a forgotten bond buried so deeply that it had nearly rewritten itself into legend. Jonah had belonged to someone once, someone who had tried to protect him, someone who had vanished when the facility shut down. Now Jonah had returned not just to find his past, but to finish what had been left behind. The red lights dimmed slowly. The pedestal retracted back into the floor. The chalk on the walls, once faded, now seemed to glow faintly in the dark. They weren't drawings. They were coordinates, messages, a trail left for someone to follow if the world ever dared to look back down. Atlas took a step forward, eyes on Jonah, then looked to Andrew. It was time to leave the room, time to uncover the last truth above the ground. The storm above the town had been silent all day. Clouds unmoving, air thick with that eerie stillness that settled before something irreversible arrived. But now, as the trapdoor beneath the daycare closed one final time behind them, the winds began to stir. It wasn't just weather. It was the feeling of the world waking up to something it had chosen to forget. Outside, the streets remained calm, the sky still a blanket of heavy gray. But beneath that calm, pulsed attention, as though the very ground knew that something long buried had returned to the surface. Andrew stepped out first into the empty playground, its rusted swings creaking with the first hints of breeze. Behind him, Atlas followed with silent precision, and Jonah emerged last, face calm, eyes scanning a world he had not seen in years, but seemed to know. The silence of the yard was shattered by the distant wail of sirens, not frantic but determined. Word had spread faster than Andrew anticipated. The security guard who had run earlier had reached someone, and that someone had called more than backup. They had called people who wore suits instead of uniforms. People who used terms like containment and asset recovery. Already, a black van had parked near the front entrance of the daycare, its tinted windows concealing movement inside. Across the street, two unmarked cars had pulled up and men stepped out, speaking into radios as they pointed toward the building. They moved with the kind of practiced urgency that came from training, not panic. Andrew stood firm in the middle of the yard, his badge still visible, though it now felt more like a relic than a shield. He had gone beneath the floor as a responding officer. He had returned as a witness to something larger than any protocol. Jonah stood beside him without hesitation. There was no fear in his posture, no instinct to flee. It was as if he had seen this moment before in drawings and dreams and whatever fractured fragments of memory had remained locked inside him all these years. Atlas, unmoving, stared toward the front gate where the first agent stepped forward, holding up a device that blinked faint blue lights. The man said nothing, but behind him the rest began to fan out, forming a perimeter. The air between both sides buzzed with tension so dense it could be felt in the lungs. Andrew looked once at Jonah, then stepped forward, raising his hands, not in surrender, but in message. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't chaos. This was the return of something unfinished. Then something unexpected happened. From behind the daycare, where the old service road wrapped around the hill, another vehicle approached. A rusted pickup truck, its paint chipped and mirrors taped in place, rolled into view. It was out of place among the sleek black SUVs and equipment-laden vans. The truck stopped abruptly, and from it stepped an elderly man, his gray beard trimmed close, his posture straight despite his age. He wore a simple brown coat and walked with a limp. But his eyes, sharp, focused, locked immediately onto Jonah. For the first time since the underground chamber, Jonah moved without hesitation. He walked toward the man, each step like a note in a melody that had waited too long to be played. The agents did not stop him. The sirens fell quiet. Everything in the yard paused as if the world itself held its breath. Jonah stood in front of the man, looking up into eyes that did not blink. The man slowly knelt down and placed his hand on Jonah's shoulder. From Andrew's position, the realization landed like a bolt through the chest. Daniel Holloway, not dead. Not missing, hidden. Whatever had happened all those years ago, whatever collapse, whatever cover-up, it had not destroyed him. He had disappeared to protect the boy. And now, drawn by a signal he had left behind in chalk and pages and half-finished lullabies, he had returned. Jonah leaned into the man's chest. Atlas walked to them and sat beside them both, completing the circle. No one moved to intervene. The agents lowered their radios. The man who had held the blinking device put it away. Andrew exhaled for the first time in minutes. Above them, the clouds began to break. A single beam of light pierced through, falling directly on the group in the yard. And just like that, the town that had buried its past beneath concrete and daycare tiles began to remember. Not through headlines, not through panic, but through the silent return of a boy, a dog, and a bond no machine could erase. The chamber below would stay sealed, but the story alive in every heartbeat was no longer a secret.